There were hundreds of homes in Brightwood Oaks, a community that marketed itself as the most charming neighborhood in the county. Every street was lined with matching mailboxes, identical fences, and strictly approved shades of beige and muted olive. Behind the smiling signs and manicured lawns existed a quieter truth. What kept Brightwood Oaks so picture-perfect wasn't kindness, pride, or community effort. It was the HOA, specifically a board known for policing every inch of the neighborhood like it was federal property. They had fined people for seasonal wreaths that weren't on the approved list, threatened families over basketball hoops, and once held a 3-hour meeting over whether a garden gnome counted as unapproved statuary. And yet, even with all of that history, nothing prepared the residents for the day the HOA declared a living creature aesthetic noncompliance. The letter showed up without warning. It was taped directly to the front door, a violation notice thick with legal phrasing and hostility dressed up as formality. It claimed that the family's rescue dog, a mixed-breed pup named Murphy, had been deemed incompatible with community standards. The reasoning was vague, intentionally so. One line stood out more than any other. Your pet's appearance is creating a negative visual impact on the neighborhood aesthetic. The words were so absurd that at first, the family thought it had to be some kind of misprint. But the HOA didn't make mistakes. They made threats. Murphy wasn't aggressive. He wasn't disruptive. He didn't bark at night. He was simply different. He had patchy fur from a past neglect case, a short mismatched tail, and an awkward gait from healed injuries. He was, in the eyes of people who loved him, beautiful. One of those dogs whose entire presence radiated gratitude and joy. But to an HOA obsessed with symmetrical window shutters and matching grass heights, Murphy wasn't aesthetic. He was a flaw in the system, a broken ornament in a perfect display case. The notice demanded that the dog be removed permanently within 14 days, or the family would face escalating fines, starting at $500 per week. The letter ended with a line that somehow managed to feel colder than the rest. This community values beauty, presentation, and pride. We expect residents to uphold these values. The family spent the entire night reading and rereading the notice, switching between disbelief and rage. They had rescued Murphy because nobody else wanted him. He had been on the list to be euthanized. They had rehabbed him, loved him, supported him, and now their own neighborhood was trying to take him away because he didn't look right. They tried to follow the proper channels first. They emailed the board. They explained Murphy's background, offered veterinary records, and requested a meeting. The board responded with a single sentence. The decision is final. No empathy, no consideration, just bureaucracy masquerading as authority. But bad decisions rarely stay hidden in Brightwood Oaks. By the weekend, neighbors began noticing the letter. Some heard about it through whispers. Others saw screenshots circulating in group chats. The reactions were overwhelming. Many were shocked. Others were furious. A few who had long despised the HOA felt like this was finally the moment everyone would see the board for what it truly was. That Sunday, for the first time since living in the neighborhood, the family opened their front door not to find more threats, but to find support. Handwritten notes, treats left for Murphy, cards that simply said, "We've got your back." This was not just about one dog anymore. It was about everything the HOA had ever tried to control. Every petty rule, every intimidation tactic, every resident who had been made to feel like they were living under surveillance, not in a community. Then came a moment that changed everything. One neighbor posted Murphy's story online, not asking for pity, but asking, "Has anyone ever heard of an HOA trying to ban a dog for being ugly?" Within hours, the post spread, first through local groups, then across the broader internet. People weren't just sharing their outrage. They were sharing their own stories of rescue pets, of unfair HOAs, of standing up to petty power. Suddenly, thousands of strangers were rooting for a dog they'd never met. And while the HOA still believed they controlled the narrative, something powerful had already begun. Murphy was no longer just a violation. He was becoming a symbol, a line in the sand between humanity and obsessive compliance, between people who cared about living beings and people who only cared about appearances. The family started walking Murphy more often, not to defy the HOA, but because neighbors kept asking to meet him. Kids started visiting the house just to play with him. Someone left a basket of dog toys at the front door with a note that said, "For the dog the HOA says isn't good enough." The board held an emergency meeting, but their solution was always the same: issue more threats. They sent a second notice, then a final warning. They quoted obscure bylaws and invented new terminology like visual disruption animal. They tried to frame the family as rule breakers, but the community no longer saw them as the problem. A silent shift was happening. The HOA was losing control. One chilly evening, the family stood on the porch with Murphy lying at their feet, finally breathing calmly for the first time that week. They knew the battle wasn't over. They knew consequences were coming. But they also knew this: they were no longer fighting alone. Something bigger was growing, slowly, quietly, but unmistakably. A resistance. And before long, the HOA was about to learn what happens when you push people too far. Because Murphy wasn't going anywhere. In fact, he was about to become the most recognized name in the entire neighborhood. The HOA assumed the second violation notice would break the family's resolve. It didn't. Instead, it triggered the opposite effect: an uprising that began subtly, then grew into something far bigger than a dispute over one rescue dog. It started with neighbors placing little paw print signs in their yards. At first, it was only a handful, small laminated cutouts, placed discreetly near mailboxes or tucked into garden beds. But within days, the number doubled, then tripled. Then came the flyers. Not official, not organized, just ordinary people printing simple black and white sheets that read, "Murphy belongs here." They weren't flashy, but they were everywhere. Taped to stop signs, stuck to community bulletin boards, tucked under windshield wipers at the community pool parking lot. The HOA kept taking them down. But every time they removed one, 5 more appeared. That was when the board realized they hadn't just picked a battle. They'd picked a battle they were losing. One of the board members, particularly fond of power, sent out an email to the entire community condemning the unauthorized signage supporting a non-compliant animal. The message was meant to sound formal and intimidating. Instead, it was screenshotted, memed, and shared online. Suddenly, Murphy wasn't just a rescue dog anymore. He was a character in a nationwide story about HOA overreach, and people loved him for it. Commenters joked that they would rather live next door to Murphy than any HOA official. They drew fan art. Someone even photoshopped him wearing a tiny crown with the caption, "All hail the king of noncompliance." The family didn't ask for any of this. They weren't activists. They weren't trying to start a movement. They were simply trying to protect the dog they had promised to love. But once people saw how the HOA reacted, cold, relentless, unable to show even basic compassion, they realized this issue was bigger than appearances. It was about principle. The HOA continued to escalate. They issued fines, then doubled them. They threatened legal action, sent certified letters, and began photographing the house. The board claimed they were maintaining order, but in reality, they were emboldening everyone who already resented their authority. A quiet rebellion was forming behind closed doors. Neighbors began talking, not in the usual polite small talk way, but in hushed, emotional conversations about how long they had tolerated the HOA. People who had never spoken beyond waving from their driveways were now gathering in kitchens and back patios, discussing strategy. Some had been fined for paint colors. Others had been warned about their children's toys being visible from the street. They all had stories, and Murphy had given them all a reason to say enough. Meanwhile, Murphy himself remained entirely unaware of his newfound fame. To him, every day was just another day, a nap on the couch, a slow walk around the block, a few cautious tail wags at anyone who knelt down and greeted him gently. He didn't understand what it meant to be ugly. He didn't understand why his existence was controversial. All he understood was love, routine, and the warmth of a hand on his head. He had lived through chaos far worse than HOA letters. He had survived abandonment. So long as he still had a home, he was content. But the family was no longer content to let the HOA dictate the terms. With every attempt by the board to silence the community, Murphy's story grew stronger. Someone created a Facebook group titled Murphy's Army. It started with a few dozen neighbors and ballooned into thousands of supporters nationwide. They weren't just angry, they were inspired. They shared stories of their own non-compliant pets. They shared rescues, transformations, before and after photos of dogs who had been discarded for similar reasons. Slowly but surely, the narrative shifted. Murphy was no longer too ugly. He was a survivor. He was an icon. He was the very definition of beauty beyond appearances. And while the community united around him, the HOA became increasingly isolated. Board members whispered among themselves, trying to regain control. They crafted new clauses, tried to rewrite old ones, attempted to change definitions mid-conflict. But every time they reached for more power, the opposition grew. It reached a boiling point when the HOA announced an emergency closed-session meeting to discuss the ongoing canine noncompliance. They locked the doors. They posted security. They thought secrecy would restore control. Instead, it enraged the neighbors even more. They gathered in the street outside, not yelling, not protesting, just standing silently together with lawn chairs, thermoses, and yes, Murphy himself, curled up beneath a blanket. Someone live-streamed it. Within an hour, thousands were watching a silent suburban standoff that felt like a scene from a movie. The HOA thought they were managing a problem discreetly. What they were really doing was fueling a narrative that they had become the villains in their own neighborhood. That night, something extraordinary happened. One family, long known for staying neutral, walked outside and turned on their garage projector. A massive image of Murphy appeared on the exterior of their house, smiling awkwardly with his crooked teeth and mismatched fur. It wasn't a protest sign. It wasn't defiance. It was a statement. This is what community looks like. And for the first time, the HOA realized they were no longer dealing with a single family. They were dealing with a movement bonded by empathy, anger, and an unexpected leader with patchy fur and a lopsided tail. Soon, Murphy wouldn't just be defended. He would be celebrated. And the HOA was about to witness what happens when a neighborhood stops being afraid. It began as a small idea whispered over a kitchen counter, shared between neighbors who had already reached their limit. They were tired of being told what beauty was supposed to look like, tired of being managed and monitored, tired of feeling like they lived in a place where appearances mattered more than people. At first, they only joked about the idea. What if Murphy wasn't just offended, but celebrated? What if the dog the HOA rejected became the very symbol of the neighborhood they were trying to control? The joke didn't stay a joke for long. It started with a single t-shirt, bold lettering, one simple phrase underneath an image of Murphy, smiling awkwardly but lovingly. Neighborhood mascot. The owner didn't think much would come of it. She only wore it while watering her plants. But the moment someone asked where they could get one, everything changed. Within days, shirts started appearing everywhere. Murphy's slightly squinty eyes and mismatched fur became a badge of honor. Kids wore them to the community playground. Adults wore them on their morning walks. People who had never even spoken to the family showed up on the porch holding shirts, asking if they could take a picture with Murphy. The HOA issued a statement calling the merchandise inappropriate and unauthorized branding. Instead of stopping it, they drew even more attention to it. Someone printed the email and taped it onto a telephone pole, right next to a poster that showed Murphy dressed as a superhero. That image was shared online, then shared again, then shared thousands of times. Now, he wasn't just a neighborhood mascot. He was a viral sensation. The family watched all of this unfold in disbelief. They had rescued a dog nobody else wanted. A dog the world had dismissed as damaged, undesirable, not worth fighting for. Now, that same dog was becoming the most recognized figure in the entire community. There were stickers on water bottles, magnetic decals on cars, and even a hand-painted mural on an old wooden fence that read, "Murphy lives here, and so do good people." When the HOA tried to force the removal of the mural, people rallied again. They offered to repaint it every day if they had to. They offered to donate their fences and homes as canvas space if it came down to it. It no longer mattered what the HOA tried to restrict. Every restriction only strengthened the resistance. The board became publicly embarrassed. They had expected the dog's story to die quietly, not explode into national attention. Reporters began reaching out. Animal rescue organizations expressed outrage. Even local politicians began making statements about overreaching HOAs. And yet, through all of this, Murphy remained completely unaware of his fame. He attended every gathering with the same humble posture, sniffing pockets for treats, tail wagging slowly and unevenly. People cried when they pet him. They whispered apologies for what he had been through. They thanked him for bringing them all together. He was no longer just a dog. He was a reminder that empathy is greater than policy. One day, the neighborhood held a block gathering, not a party, because that would require an HOA permit, just an informal, simultaneous outdoor leisure activity. Dozens of people showed up. Fold-out chairs lined the cul-de-sac. Coolers were rolled out. Children wore cardboard cutout dog ears and called themselves the Murphy Patrol. Someone suggested the ultimate step, that the neighborhood adopt Murphy as the official community mascot. The idea was outrageous, not because it was impossible, but because it was exactly the sort of thing the HOA would lose its mind over. And that was precisely why people loved it. It wouldn't be long before that idea became unavoidable, before it turned from sentiment into strategy, because the community no longer wanted to just resist the HOA. They wanted to change the identity of the neighborhood itself. But with every act of unity, the HOA became more unstable behind the scenes. Internal emails leaked. Board members argued. One threatened to resign. Another demanded a motion to censor all references to the animal matter. Each of them had built their entire authority on the idea that they alone defined what the community should look like. Now the community was defining itself without them. Whispers began spreading that the board was preparing something drastic. Legal action, forced removal, maybe even seizing the homeowner's rights. They were too proud, too committed to control, to let a non-compliant animal undermine them. They believed they still held power. But power only works when people accept it. And people had stopped accepting it the moment Murphy became more than just a dog. They now saw clearly what the HOA didn't want them to see, that their rules were never about safety or order or pride. They were about control. They were about deciding who belonged and who didn't. They were about maintaining a system that only cared about appearances, never humanity. Murphy didn't fit their mold, so the neighborhood changed the mold. The movement was now unstoppable. And as the next HOA meeting approached, an open meeting, one they couldn't legally lock the doors to, the entire neighborhood began preparing not for war, but for something far more powerful. Transformation. Because if the board insisted on meeting to discuss the dog, then the community was finally ready to show them exactly who that dog had become. Not a violation, not an eyesore, not a problem to be removed, but the heart of Brightwood Oaks. The next HOA meeting was supposed to be routine. The board had planned for it with the same self-assured efficiency they always relied on, an agenda, printed in official HOA formatting, locked to a rigid schedule, financial report, landscape compliance review, nuisance enforcement updates, and, listed at the very bottom, pet violation case #47-2A, resolution. The phrasing was intentionally vague, a way of making something emotional sound clinical and unimportant. They expected a handful of residents to attend, maybe the dog's owners, maybe a few neighbors. What they got instead was a turning point. The meeting was scheduled for 7 o'clock at the community center, a beige building with the charm of a tax office and the warmth of a hospital waiting room. The board arrived early, expecting to control the environment the way they always had. They laid out the chairs, set up a podium, and placed a stack of printed bylaws next to a decorative vase that looked like it had been stolen from a library lobby somewhere. Then the residents began arriving. First a few, then a wave, then a flood. Within minutes, every seat was taken, and then every wall was lined. Parents holding children, Elderly neighbors leaning on canes. Teenagers, retirees, newcomers, longtime residents. People who had never once bothered to attend an HOA meeting were suddenly there, silent and present, wearing shirts, hats, pins, or stickers depicting the same familiar face. Murphy. The board immediately sensed a shift, but they had no plan for it. They had always relied on silence and apathy. Now, they were surrounded, not by hostility, but by unity. Murphy himself arrived last, not because he was dramatic, but because he was a dog who traveled slowly, tail wagging unevenly, tongue out in his perpetually goofy smile. The moment he walked through the door, the room shifted. People instinctively turned toward him. A few gasped, some smiled, and many simply watched silently, emotionally, as he settled down in his blanket near the front of the room. The board tried to regain formal control. They followed the agenda. They avoided mentioning the obvious tension. They recited budget numbers, talked about shrub trimming, and used bureaucratic language to keep the meeting rigid and impersonal. But every person in that room was waiting for one thing. The moment they reached pet violation case, hashtag 47-2A, the air changed. Board President Walter Green adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and began reading the statement prepared in advance. It was everything people expected: cold language, references to bylaws, phrases like visual uniformity and community aesthetic obligations. But for the first time in HOA history, nobody was intimidated. Because the people listening weren't just residents. They were witnesses. They had already seen the bigger story. They had already chosen their side. When Green finished his statement, the room remained quiet, not because the residents were afraid, but because they refused to play the board's game. The silence wasn't submission. It was resistance, and the HOA board was not prepared for resistance. Reports from this night would later describe what happened next as something that did not need speeches or arguments. There were no angry outbursts, no shouting, no banners. The neighborhood didn't show up to fight. They showed up to exist in a way that proved the board wrong. A community organized around compassion was sitting right in front of them. A dog they called unacceptable was now the most loved face in the room. The board tried to push forward, but every sentence sounded weaker than the last. Every policy suddenly seemed small and absurd compared to the reality in front of them. A dog they had tried to label as ugly had become the living embodiment of community. Then something else happened, something the board never planned for. The residents began placing envelopes and letters on the table, then handmade posters, then testimonials, then petitions. Every item bore the same message in different words: Murphy stays. They had collected signatures, statements from veterinarians, rescue organizations, trainers, neighbors, supporters nationwide. They didn't come to beg, they came to document, to show, in undeniable evidence, that the community the board claimed to represent had spoken. Murphy was not the violation. The HOA was, and the board was collapsing under the weight of its own hubris. By the end of the meeting, the board was defeated, even if they refused to admit it. They had no enforcement plan, no argument strong enough to counter what had unfolded. They didn't just lose control of the narrative, they lost the narrative entirely. That night, something irreversible happened. The people of Brightwood Oaks no longer feared the HOA. They no longer hesitated. They no longer whispered. They had outgrown the authority that once ruled them. And the board, in its desperation, made its final mistake. Instead of backing down, instead of allowing reason, instead of accepting the will of their own community, they chose escalation. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived at the family's doorstep. Not a fine, not a warning. An official demand to remove the dog within 7 days, signed unanimously by the board. It was the harshest enforcement action they had ever taken. And it was the moment the community realized something important. They weren't just defending Murphy anymore. They were going to take down the HOA, and they were going to do it publicly. Because if the board wanted to make this a battle, then they were about to find out just how powerful the side of empathy and community could really become. The certified removal order should have been the end of it. The HOA believed that this final act of authority would crush the family, isolate the dog, and force compliance. They believed fear would outweigh loyalty. They believed the neighborhood's sympathy would fade once real consequences began. They believed their reputation mattered more than a rescue dog. They were wrong. The day the letter arrived, the family stood on the porch holding it in silence. Not because they were defeated, but because they already knew the next step. The HOA had crossed a line they could never uncross. The fight was no longer about warnings or fines. It was about the right to exist without permission. And the community was ready. Within hours, residents were coordinating like a well-organized campaign, not with anger, but with purpose. Someone contacted a local animal rights lawyer. Someone else began gathering every document the HOA had ever sent. Others compiled the board's previous abuses, photos, evidence, timestamps, screenshots of threats, and intimidation tactics. They dug up bylaws, state regulations, and legal precedents. They were no longer protesting. They were preparing a case. News began spreading outside the neighborhood. First one local journalist, then three, then a popular online outlet that specialized in HOA horror stories. The headline was simple. HOA orders family to remove rescue dog for being aesthetic violation. The public's response was immediate. Outrage, mockery, solidarity. Strangers, total strangers, began donating to help the family fight. Animal advocacy groups shared petitions. Rescue organizations offered support. People across the country posted pictures of their non-compliant pets with the caption, "Would my dog be allowed in Brightwood Oaks?" The HOA tried to counter the narrative, claiming the dog was a disturbance, that the case had nothing to do with appearance, that the family was misrepresenting the facts. But truth spreads faster than damage control when people are already fed up. Screenshots of the original letter resurfaced. The exact phrase, "negative visual impact," was printed on flyers, banners, memes, and protest signs. No amount of backpedaling could erase what they had already written. Meanwhile, Murphy remained unaware of the war being waged in his name. He was sitting in a pile of blankets while neighbors slipped him treats and whispered reassurance. The community knew he had once been abandoned. They knew he had lived in fear before. They refused to let it happen again. Then came the plan that would change everything. A group of residents, who had once been silent, compliant, and afraid, decided to turn the HOA's own system against them. They began circulating documents to recall the board. Legal, procedural, official paperwork drafted exactly according to HOA bylaws. If enough signatures were gathered, the entire board could legally be removed and replaced. But there was a problem. The HOA had designed the rules to make recall nearly impossible. A supermajority vote, strict procedural deadlines, mandatory forms most residents had never even seen. It seemed impossible until the community realized they no longer had to play by the HOA's timeline. They could go bigger. Instead of a quiet procedural removal, they would make this public. Loud, visible, unignorable. They planned a neighborhood event, one that didn't require HOA approval because it wasn't a party. It was a parade for one dog. The announcement spread like wildfire. Hand-painted signs, sidewalk chalk messages, email chains, social media posts. People planned costumes, printed banners, and ordered custom dog bandanas just to be part of it. Even people who had never cared about HOA politics suddenly had a reason to show up. Because a fight over rules is boring. But a fight over a dog who survived abandonment and became a symbol? That was inspiring. The HOA panicked. They sent out warnings, citing unlawful assembly, unauthorized gatherings, and public obstruction. They threatened fines, enforcement, even legal action. They stood at the edge of their own breaking point. But the community had already crossed theirs. The night before the parade, residents prepared like they were setting up for a festival. Lights were strung across trees. Chalk paw prints led down the sidewalk. Children drew murals in driveways. People baked treats and ice cupcakes with Murphy's face, crooked teeth, and all. It wasn't just about saving a dog anymore. It was about reclaiming the neighborhood. And on the morning of the parade, before the first poster was lifted and before the first chant was spoken, residents across Brightwood Oaks stepped outside to find something waiting on their lawns. Someone, overnight, had placed miniature yard signs at every house. Each one bore the same 3 words: "We choose Murphy." And in that moment, every house became a vote. Every yard became a message. And every person, whether they spoke or not, had taken a side. The HOA had power, but the community now had something stronger: unity. The parade was hours away, and if the HOA thought they had seen resistance before, they were about to learn what happens when an entire neighborhood decides they're done being ruled by people they never respected. Because Murphy wasn't just staying. Murphy was taking over, and the world was about to watch it happen. The parade began quietly. No megaphones, no speeches, no chanting, just a slow, steady wave of people stepping out of their homes, one by one, wearing shirts, carrying signs, holding leashes with their own dogs beside them, as if the entire community had simultaneously decided to breathe for the first time in years. At the front of it all, wrapped in a bandana printed with the words "Neighborhood Mascot," walked Murphy. His gait was still uneven, his fur still patchy, his tail still crooked, but he walked like he belonged because he finally did. People lined the sidewalks. Some cried, some laughed, some simply stood in awe at the sight of a neighborhood coming together not out of obligation, but out of love. The parade was not loud, but it was powerful. Every step said something the HOA had never understood. Beauty was not sameness. Community was not control. And belonging was not earned through compliance. The HOA board showed up, but not to support. They tried to stop it. They threatened legal action. They demanded the event be shut down immediately. They waved papers and quoted bylaws. But as they stood in the middle of the street yelling rules, not a single person stopped walking. They were drowned out. Not by noise, but by irrelevance. The board members looked around and saw something they had never seen before: absolute, undeniable loss of authority. No one was listening. No one was afraid. And worst of all for them, everyone was happy. Photos and videos of the parade spread instantly. Local reporters captured footage of Murphy riding at the front in a little red wagon decorated like a float. News headlines started calling it the parade that broke the HOA. It became a viral phenomenon, something bigger than the neighborhood, bigger than the dog, bigger than anyone ever expected. The next week, a recall petition swept through Brightwood Oaks like a storm. The required signatures weren't just met, they were exceeded. Dozens of residents who had previously stayed neutral now had the confidence to speak. They told their own stories of harassment, intimidation, unreasonable fines, and quiet resentment that had been simmering for years. The HOA board tried to challenge the recall. They failed. 2 board members resigned before the vote even happened. The others were removed in a single night, replaced with residents who truly cared about the community, not controlling it. And the very first motion the new board voted on was short, simple, and unanimously approved. Effective immediately, there shall be no prohibition against any animal based on appearance, breed, or perceived aesthetic value. Not only did Murphy get to stay, he became part of the official HOA history. But it didn't stop there. The community decided to embrace the very thing the board had tried to erase. They installed a permanent mural on the side of the community center. A massive painting, not sleek nor symmetrical, not corporate nor polished, but full of color, warmth, and movement. At the center was Murphy, smiling just the way he always did, surrounded by messages from the community. Every life has value. Our neighborhood is more than a rule book. This is what belonging looks like. Murphy never understood the politics, never understood the headlines, the fundraising, the legal filings, the documentaries, or the flood of visitors who came just to meet him. He only understood that he was loved. And every person who looked at him understood something too, that the ugliest things in the world are never scars, uneven fur, or crooked features. The ugliest things are cruelty, power without compassion, and rules that place appearance above kindness. The story of Murphy became legend not because he was rescued, but because he rescued everyone else right back. He reminded people what mattered. He exposed what didn't. And he helped transform a neighborhood that had forgotten what community even meant. In the months that followed, Brightwood Oaks changed. Homes began to look more unique. People planted gardens that weren't on the approved list. Neighbors actually talked to each other, not just through formal notices or complaint emails. And on every street, no matter which direction you walked, you could spot at least one Murphy sign proudly displayed. Some said the neighborhood was less perfect now. Most said it finally felt like a place worth living in. Murphy lived out the rest of his life adored, protected, and celebrated. Never again at risk of being abandoned, discarded, or judged by anyone who thought they could define beauty on paper. He passed peacefully many years later, surrounded by the very people who once stood on their porches with nothing in common but shared refusal to bow to injustice. And every year since the day of the parade, Brightwood Oaks has held the same event in his honor. Not as a protest, but as a tradition. A celebration not of a dog, but of what that dog inspired. People still come wearing shirts that say, "We choose Murphy." They still draw chalk paw prints down the street. They still remember the time a single rescue dog brought down an entire HOA. Not with violence, not with rage, but with community. Murphy was never too ugly. He was simply too honest for a place that had forgotten what real beauty was. Until he helped them remember.